You ever been curious as to who the heck I even am? Where this channel got its start? Where the idea of story surgery began in the first place? Or even the process that goes into making a story surgery video? Well, I'd say you're in luck. This video is dedicated to all the frequently asked questions I regularly get, so let's get started. That would be me. That would also be me. I do that too. I'm just somebody who loves storytelling a lot and likes to draw and write stuff. I suppose the first thing I should talk about is what came first chronologically, my love of drawing. According to my parents and many of my siblings and friends, I've been drawing stuff as young as 4 years old, and now, nearly 25 years later, I'm still, well, drawing stuff. Ever since I was young, I knew that I wanted to work in video production. It really all started off when I was around 7-ish years old, when I was allowed to start using the camcorder that my family was using for home movies. I filmed everything. Random things I found interesting, stuff with my friends, my family, stuff at school, everything. For Christmas a few years later, I was given a camcorder of my very own, and just like that, it was a full steam ahead. It got to the point where if anyone at school needed a video done for a class, I was almost always the first person they'd ask, and a good chunk of the time, I wasn't even in the class that they were in. For the longest time, I thought I wanted to be a film editor, helping cut down and making blockbuster hits for Hollywood. I thought about this from elementary school all the way out to my second year of college. I was taking these video editing classes, but because I had been doing video stuff so early in my lifetime, my ability to learn new information was becoming stagnant. I didn't feel like I was being taught anything that was to my benefit. It was nothing against my teachers or even the source material. They were all wonderful in their own right. It more or less came down to the stern realization that I just knew all of this already. Heck, I had been doing it for almost 13 years in my own spare time. I was able to find some workarounds by channeling my doodling and illustration work that I've been doing ever since I was so young and workshopping it into better understanding things like storyboarding and even concept artwork for things like film and television and even video game design. But again, because I had been doing it for so long, my doodling only got me so far. I only needed to take a couple of these classes before I really felt like I already understood where the class was going. And just like that, things felt stagnant again. As you can imagine, this was creatively and mentally frustrating. Every single time I managed to start taking a new class, not even halfway through the first quarter, I felt like I was being taught things that I already knew. It's only when I started taking my script writing courses that something in my brain clicked. It was the realization that I wasn't interested in movies because they were film. It's because I loved telling stories, no matter how large or small they were. I then learned how to write a bunch of different types of formats, namely starting with screenwriting for film and television. And after I got done doing that, I moved on to different ideas, different formats like novelization, comic and graphic novel production. I graduated from my university with a major in film and video production with a dual minor, one in screenwriting and the other in advertising. Outside of story surgery, I work in commercial multimedia production for local and online businesses, which allows me to use my videography, my video editing, my sound design, my storyboarding, my graphic design, my illustration, and my screenwriting. Heck, even my voice manages to land in some commercials now and then. I'm sure there are probably a few of you who found your way to this video or this channel and asked the big hitting question. Why am I tackling this game or this movie or this show or this book? What's the point in talking about something that's already completed? And those who will inform me that a video on the subject matter won't change the source material. And while it's a rough way of thinking about it, they're right. It won't. Story surgery is never about creating the definitive version of whatever it is that we're talking about. I'm not trying to make a video that talks about the version of the story that we're inventing here and saying that is the better or best version of the story. All I want to do is get you, the viewer, potential story developers and writers to think about stories that you've experienced. The changes that I present or even ask you as the audience to imagine using these reworked versions are happy hypotheticals, innocent ideas, and casual concepts. Sure, at times these can range from simple changes scattered throughout a story in question, and at other times it's about re-examining the entire story as a whole. The versions of the stories we think about here are just that, another version, a different way to tackle the story so that certain ideas or elements from the original could land just a little bit better on their feet and deliver the punch they could have been going for. There are 3 types of videos for this channel: story surgeries, element diagnosis, and the pre-op post-op podcasts. Surgery videos are the bread and butter of this channel. The idea is that we are presented with a medium that had a trip-up of any caliber, big or small, and talk about what that trip-up was for the narrative. In most cases, these videos are about how we, as writers and story developers, could potentially make small little changes or even large ones. Other times, surgeries are about figuring out what these particular things did that work for the benefit of the story they belong to, or even potentially discussing how the media manages to fit so well within its category. Next up, you have diagnosis videos. While the first episode that I did that was labeled as diagnosis videos was about the Nutcracker in the Four Realms Disney film, I actually shifted gears a little bit in terms of what I want these videos to be moving forward. Diagnosis videos are going to be shorter form videos talking about story development terminology and examples, a means to help people understand story elements that are used when it comes to crafting a story, explaining what a protagonist is, the difference between internal and external conflict, talking about the variance in point of view depending on what the structure of your story is, or even going so far as to explain certain terminologies that are seen within story writing, such as the difference between diegetic and non-diegetic story elements and the examples of various plot devices when and how they're used within a story. Finally, we have 2 breeds of podcasts. Pre-op podcasts are about sitting down with someone or even a group of people and talking about upcoming media that we are personally excited about, or at least looking forward to when it eventually arrives. It's a chance to talk about our expectations, our hopes, our fears, what excites us about this media, or potentially what we're most afraid of when it comes to this media finally arriving at our doorstep. Post-op podcasts are the conversations that I, or the group of individuals for that episode, have recently seen something, as a means to give our reactions or reviews about the medium. It serves as a chance to talk about the story's strengths, as well as act as a sort of off-the-cuff brainstorming session for what could have been done for the story differently in terms of its narrative weaknesses. Well, the simple answer for where story surgery began was that it had been in my head for over a decade, and that the first ever concept I did for a story rewrite was when I was in high school, wherein I wrote down this idea of combining the Secret of NIMH film with the novel that it was based on to create something altogether new. The Secret of NIMH video that is currently on this channel stands as still one of my favorite videos that I've ever done so far. It was a relief to know that something that had been bouncing around in my head for so long was now in a format that I can look at, share, and be proud of. Now, the concept of story surgery as a channel really became solidified back in 2016 with the release of Rogue One, a Star Wars story, where I walked out of the theater, went home, sat down in front of my microphone, and talked to myself for about an hour about how I thought the focus of the film was directed at the wrong character, that I thought that there was someone else that the film could have been focused on as the lead protagonist in the film, and gave my ideas of what that could have done for this interesting idea of a Star Wars-based espionage story. Something that keeps its gritty tone while managing to have a different story, but still managing to keep the heart of what made the original so unique. I, by pure happenstance, titled that file on my computer as Rogue One, a Story Surgery. And just like that, title drop. And yes, that video is coming down the pipeline, don't worry about it. If it isn't already there already, I don't know. Time is really weird right now. Well, as you'd expect, a lot of it comes down to me watching the source material of some kind. Whether it be a novel that I read, a movie that I watched, a TV show that I had gotten through, or a video game that I had personally played or watched somebody else do a playthrough of. I examine the narrative for what it was in the time frame that it was allotted. Most of the time, I'm taking mental notes while the story is playing out, but I truly try to wait until after I finish something in its completion before I really start to dissect what had happened in the story. Sometimes the story manages to trip a few times to the point where I can't help but start taking mental or even physical notes and ideas and concepts and general execution. And yes, there were times where I would actually pull out a small pad of paper and a pencil and would take notes in the middle of a theater while surrounded by my friends and my peers, because I'm that kind of person sometimes. More often than not, a lot of the general ideas for how story surgery videos work is about asking what the smallest changes we could possibly make to something that would have helped it stick the landing and not trip up as much as the story possibly did. Occasionally, it's as easy as saying that the plot element should have just waited a couple more minutes before being introduced, or they should have gone left rather than right. These kinds of changes to the narrative are hard to make a video about sometimes because they tend to be so small that making an entire video about them is a little tricky. Something I consider doing is a video that is just dedicated to a compilation of small edits that you can make to a given narrative in a particular medium. But right now, it's more just a concept in my head. In other instances, it's about helping a story by making changes that are a little larger in scope, depending on the need and the severity of what that story needs in question. Should the story have focused on a different character? Was the story told in a tone that differs too far from the message that was trying to be given? Or would it benefit from just shifting to a different flavor of tonality? Is the story based on or adapted from something else, and does that adaptation do something that it should have stayed closer to the original or strayed a little farther away from the material it was based on? Now, these changes aren't large per se, but they do carry weight to them that changes the impact and overall execution of the story being told. And then there are the times where I basically have to rework a story from the ground up. These ones get really tricky, because a good majority of the time, the ideas that are wanting to be implemented into this reworked version of this story are based off of several things. Was the characterization of the protagonists and antagonists clash with the theme or the tone with the story overall? Did the story take too long or go too quickly when trying to roll out its details? And does it not pan out the way that it should have? Does the story promise too much and underdeliver, or have a simple premise that becomes overly complicated? Does the story have a good collection of wonderful ideas that it just does nothing with, leaving those ideas to just sit there underutilized? If these are the kinds of questions you have to ask about a story, it means that we're in for the long haul for getting this story on the table. When it comes to computing hardware, I am a hybrid user. Simply put, I use Windows and Mac OS symbiotically, as I believe that they both have their uses and advantages. When it comes to writing scripts, I end up using two main programs. Scrivener for brainstorming and blocking out ideas, and then heading over to Google Docs to actually write down the actual script. Why Google Docs, you ask? Well, it's because I tend to verbally dictate out my scripts by using speech to text. It allows me to get a first draft out of my head, where I'm just reading out my ideas. No going back and editing what I just said, just focusing on getting it out of my headspace and onto something else outside of my head. It's here that I actually use text to speech to actually have my first draft be read back to me. A good chunk of the time while I'm using something like speech to text, I might gloss over one or two things or accidentally throw in some grammatical errors, or perhaps I don't realize that a particular sentence or block sounds completely bonkers when narrated back to me in a monotone, uncharacteristically robotic voice. When it comes to drawing out these storyboards that you see in my videos, I primarily use Photoshop and Procreate. I'm never really aiming to make any large-scale works of art. The storyboard is there to help the production team understand the general direction, framing, and composition, i.e., it's there to provide a visual aid for the scenes I'm describing at the time. In terms of audio recording, I use Audio-Technica microphones, specifically the AT2020 USB Plus previously, and recently I've paired an AT2035 with a Yamaha MG10XU mixer board, by which I record primarily directly into Adobe Audition. In terms of editing software, Final Cut Pro and After Effects are my go-to. I've been using Final Cut Pro 10 since it debuted in June of 2011, and it's just what I'm the most familiar and comfortable with. It allows me to get exactly where I need to go the most efficiently. It's at this point in time where using the dual computer setup of both Mac OS and Windows OS tends to help quite a lot. While Final Cut is currently being used on the Mac, I'll usually have my Windows machine running After Effects in the background, processing visual components that I'll be using for the video in its final composition. Yes and no. It's kind of a weird gray area. Yes, because it is a work of fiction that in some cases it is a fan who is writing them. At the same time, I don't know if you can consider them to be fan fiction because I'm not just writing a story and throwing it out into the world. I don't want to just write something, hand it out to people and say, here's the fixed version, you're welcome. To me, that doesn't really do anything but just sort of act as a attempt to overwrite the original version. If I make make a version of a story that is different, I want to go into the finer details about why these changes are being made, explaining my reasonings, and helping people understand why these elements could or would help the story overall. Take my video I did on The Secret of NIMH, for example. This was me taking two completely different elements of the original stories, being the original novel and the Don Bluth film that used the novel as inspiration, and I wrote a version that combines the sum of both parts, figuring a way to keep the theme of the novel while keeping the mystical elements of the movie adaptation. I am somebody who adores and loves both the novel and the movie because they managed to tell the same story in so many different interesting ways. The video was essentially just a love letter to both the film and the book, saying, I like both of these things, let me just smush them together and make something new. In other cases, I do attempt to reimagine the story from mostly the ground up. The example I'll use here is the video I did for the Netflix live-action adaptation of Death Note. This was a time when I looked at a story as a whole and realized that the intent of the adaptation just did not stick the landing it was intending to go for, with the primary focus being the story being moved to a physically different location in the world. The original manga took place in Japan and properly utilized the location for its influences. The Netflix adaptation was randomly set in Seattle, Washington, and didn't take any advantage of the new location. Instead, we got a story that tried something drastic that didn't know what it was doing for the story's sake, resulting in something that just felt misguided. So yeah, sometimes it's as simple as just showcasing why small narrative and stylistic choices should have been changed, and other times it's a full-blown reconstruction focused on showcasing to the viewers why the original didn't stick the landing and how certain changes, whether they be big or small, would help the story land on its narrative points to leave a bigger impact. So I don't think it's fan fiction, but I'm sure somebody could easily prove me wrong, I guess. There's a lot of things that go into answering that kind of question, but 9 times out of 10, I'm making these videos completely on my own. That other 10th of the time is when I have a friend of mine or somebody else contribute a small part to the video in question. The first time I ever did this was with the Netflix Death Note video that I did, where I had my bud, Christian K, help explain what Death Note was to the viewer. The most recent example of this, from when this video is getting posted, is when I had my longtime friend, Sing Me a Sentence, lend her voice to a recap that I wrote about the history of the Harry Potter franchise. Anytime I get my friends to talk about their favorite stories, I try to do my best to do that because I have some very passionate friends who do love themselves a good story. Other than that, I'm brainstorming, writing, drawing, narrating, editing, and producing these videos in my own free time, and free time's not something I have a terrible amount of currently. I got a lot of real-world stuff going on at the moment, and while story surgery is something I would absolutely dream about doing full-time, that's just not how my life works right now, and that's okay. I'm fine dedicating what free time I have towards something I genuinely enjoy doing immensely. Maybe, maybe not. It's kind of hard to tell given the subject matter in question tends to dictate how long that particular episode is going to be. Sometimes the video can be within a 10-minute mark because what I have to say on the matter is something really simple in comparison. Other times I have a little bit more to say, so the video gets a little longer. And then when it comes to rewrite, the length of the video kind of is determined by amount of data, story points, writing elements that I want to present to the viewer. The greatest kind of compare and contrast version of this would be the Sonic Forces video that I did that was 34 minutes long, while the Sonic 06 video I did was 2 hours and 8 minutes long. I don't do that intentionally. It just sorta happens. Also, the project size for that Sonic 06 video ended up being 316 gigabytes. Just remembering that was how big that file size was still just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies just thinking about it. I'm sure that if someone else was editing these videos, or if I had a series of people edit the scripts down, the videos could be shorter, but at the same time, I'm not trying to make a version of these episodes that are the TLDR snippets. I want these videos to be packed full of information and data and story writing elements and techniques that can both be entertaining but also educational to some degree. And I know that there are those who believe that my longer videos should be cut down into multiple parts, but I personally can't see the gain for that. I know that on a technical standpoint, if there's more videos on the subject matter, it statistically would result in more potential views. As it stands right now on YouTube, I just don't don't see any practical use of that element. If this was on a different platform where the length of video was more limited for a more strict time frame, then that would be the time. But as it stands right now, sometimes the videos are really short and sometimes they're really long. Just sort of happens that way, I guess. Oh, I would love to have people help out with story surgery so bad, you can only imagine. The main reason why I haven't yet is because I just haven't found a reliable way to do so, and I don't have the funds to adequately compensate. Simply put, if I want somebody to utilize their creative abilities seriously to contribute said abilities to a project in question, I want to make sure that they are compensated properly for their action. I've been a commission person who has done videography, photography, graphic design, illustration, vocal performances, story writing for 15 years. I know the pain of putting your heart and soul into a project only to have the person who hired you tell you that your price tag has changed, they need to ask you a favor and a discount, or that they tell you that your price is too high and that makes you a greedy person who uses their talent to cheat people out of money. I've heard a lot of them. I don't ever want to be the person who does that to somebody else. If I'm looking for somebody who treats the creative process with as much energy and love as I do for this series, I want to make sure that they are compensated for their efforts. As it stands right now, I just don't have the funds to do this properly. Honestly, that's where a potential Patreon situation would be for story surgery. It would go to fund people supplying their voices for characters, artists who do concept artwork and storyboards for these rewrites that we do here. It would allow these creatives to stretch their creative muscles and have something to show with it, both in production and in revenue. Artists gotta eat too, you know? That's okay. Nobody's telling you that these ideas that I present here are ones that you have to like. All the ideas are simply happy hypotheticals in terms of how the story could have been done differently to achieve a different outcome. These videos are not supposed to act as a erasure of the original story, rather just a different way to interpret how it could have been written or presented. Where the "I don't like your idea" comments can turn into a bit of a bummer is when they're just one-off blurbs and the user in question doesn't want to have a conversation about it, or they just reply with, "Well, I just don't like it," and they never elaborate. If something I wrote or presented didn't land with you, I want to talk about it. Sure, some of that is because I want to get better at presentation, but honestly though, it's just because I want to talk about it and hear about what makes these stories work for different people. Criticism is inevitable, especially when it comes to things that have a strong established fan base. For me, it's just so disappointing when I want some kind of elaboration on why the viewer didn't like the thing that I did, but they just either give a single response or they never follow up on it. A lot of people find it weird, but when I find somebody who has a negative reaction to the video or idea that I've done in this series, I want to sit down with them and talk to them. And not in a, "Well, let me make you understand why my idea is superior," but more as a means to ask, "Could you explain what I did here that didn't work for you?" I want to understand where your perspective is coming from so that I can understand this moving forward. I tend to leave replies on people's comments that range from a simple "Oh, thank you very much" to a whopping thesis of a conversation spanning a few thousand words. Two of the longest conversations I had are on my Secret of Nim episode, where I ended up having a 16,000 word plus conversation between myself and the user desk drawer. They brought a perspective that I knew a lot of people had, which was the idea that the film adaptation was their version of choice versus the novel that the film was based off of. But the conversations and ideas that we had that we kind of went back and forward on is what made that conversation so interesting and captivating for me. The other conversation that I had spanned over 25,000 words between me and a user over on Reddit for my video I did on Life is Strange Before the Storm. They originally started off with a very mixed feeling about the video as a whole. Eventually, we started this huge, humongous thread between the two of us and just talked about story elements. Some things we agreed on and other things we didn't, but that really never stopped us from continuing our conversation until the two of us had essentially wrote a novel just from our casual conversations alone. In the end, it really just does come back to this idea of, while, yeah, it's okay if you don't like the ideas that I present here, or that you prefer the original stories versus what I do here. But more often, I just really want to talk to people about what about the original worked so well with them. It helps me have a better grasp and understanding about when a rewrite truly is a benefactor versus when something might be a, well, just a happy hypothetical. This is a common and really tricky question to answer, simply because in order for me to do an in-depth analysis and restructuring of a story, I need to have watched or read the story in question. It's a bit of a bummer when somebody asks me to workshop something based on a source material that I hadn't gotten around to yet, or a genre that was never really my style, therefore I never really viewed it as a potential because I just didn't have the drive to do so. I could try and binge a series or watch a series of movies really quickly to get a feel for why the person didn't like the story and wanted me to take a crack at it, but I don't like rushing through something that I feel like I really need to sit down and enjoy and analyze the story for what it is, so that a reworked video that you could do on it would feel authentic. Now, with that said, if a certain number of people ask me to cover something, I will try to read or watch that story in a timely manner to give a potential chance for a story surgery episode. There have been a good number of people who have wanted me to do a video on the final season of Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, I have not seen a single episode of Game of Thrones. Not out of disinterest. It is entirely because when everything was kind of taking off with Game of Thrones, I was still in college and just did not have the free time to dedicate to the series. Now that everything's concluded, it's more doable, but that would still take a long time to watch, and then consider the complete reworking that people have been asking for. To reiterate, I will always consider doing a video on things that are recommended, but just please keep in mind that in order for me to do something in a timely manner, I have to know what the source material is in some way, shape, or form in order to do a story surgery on that medium. So just keep that in mind, please. Hello Rushini asks, what kind of headphones are you wearing and what kind of music do you listen to? Yes, these things. A fun tidbit about headphones in relationship to myself. I've been wearing headphones since middle school. I've always been the music listening type. It helps me tune out the bonkers nature of the world and puts me in the moment, whether it be for unwinding after a long day or by using music to channel a creative mindset when writing a script or drawing something or editing a video or working on other personal projects. I have went through a bunch of different headphones over the years, most of which I've managed to hold on to and make somewhat of a shrine on my wall. In case you're wondering, it looks like this. Notable brands on the wall include WeSC, August, Sony, and Outdoor Technologies. Most of the headphones on the wall are discontinued, and pretty much all of them are broken in some way, shape, or form. Some more than others. The headphones I draw on myself are a sort of amalgamation of all the headphones I've had over the years. As for what I listen to, I tend to listen to all different kinds of genres. A lot of the time, my musical interests will shift depending on what it is that I'm doing. If I'm writing a scene for an original story or even a script idea, or if I'm working on any one of these video scripts or editing something, or I'm at work, I'm just listening to music in general. To give you an idea of how wide and varied the day-to-day musical tastes are, I'm linking in the description a playlist simply entitled EPZ's Pocketed Songs, which is a playlist of all the songs I have liked and downloaded on Spotify. I just literally highlighted all of them, dragged them into a new playlist, and there they are. There are some weird ones in there, I'm not gonna lie. Dogman asks, what's a guilty pleasure story for you? Oh man, that's such a heavy question. That entirely depends on the medium we're talking about, as well as any subgenres of said medium as well. Like, I have favorite stories across different formats and genres. When it comes to guilty pleasure stories, as in something people would think weird of me for liking as much as I do, well, let's see. My favorite book series is Peter and the Starcatchers by Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson. I think it's one of the best executions of a reimagining of an older story, but I didn't quite care for the Broadway adaptation, as I felt it lost a lot of what made the books unique. One of my favorite movies of all time is Mamoru Hosoda's Summer Wars, because I love how the movie manages to handle its exposition, ensemble casting, and environmental world building. I'm a sucker for the slice of life genre of anime, K-On! Being a personal favorite of mine because it reminds me so much of being in high school and I could literally watch that show whenever and I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm a big fan of the Tron franchise, and I think it's one of the best versions of the Wonderland story trope, and I'm still upset that the show Tron Uprising got canceled after a single season. I think Star Fox Assault was the best thing to happen to Star Fox in a series by delivering a story that was expansive and impactful. I know people are going to yell at me for that one, but it's my perspective, and I'm going to live with it, gosh darn it. So yeah, I have a lot of particular guilty pleasure stories for me personally. Like, I could legitimately go on for like another couple of minutes just ranting off a bunch more, but let's just keep this concise right now. And with that, we've come to the end of our frequently asked questions video and the new channel trailer. If you have your own burning questions that you've always been wanting to ask, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my very best to answer them in any way, shape, and form that I can. So, with that in mind, and now that we've gotten the setup and details squared away, wash those hands, ready your tools, and put on your thinking caps, story people. Get ready for the next wave of operations.